Hello, I recently put together a video on my top 20 biblical archaeology discoveries, and the first half of it I talked about discoveries which I rated from 20 down to 11. So this video talks about my top 10. So let me share my screen. As I noted in the other video where I discussed numbers 20 through 11, um, it's really a matter of opinion and just one's own judgment as to what is the more important discovery. It depends on what you're considering as the criteria, and a lot of it is just opinion, but it's kind of fun, I think, to talk about some of these. So this is my number 10. This is the Merneptah Stele. A stele is a stone setup, and it was set up by Pharaoh Merneptah, who lived 1213 to 1203 BC. That is using the standard Egyptian chronology, which not everybody accepts that that chronology is correct. But if that is correct, then there would be 1213 to 1203 BC. And so the date for this stele would be in the middle of it, about 1208 BC. And so the significance of this one is that it describes his military campaign in the land of Canaan. And he says this, he says, the Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. And by saying that, that actually becomes the first reference to Israel that exists outside of the Bible. So 1208 BC, we have our first reference to Israel by somebody other than the Bible. So number 9, this is the Mesha stele, or Moabite stone. This was set up by King Mesha of Moab, and I think if it wasn't for this, we would know nothing about the Moabite language, which is really a Canaanite language, not unlike Hebrew. It dates to 840 BC, and this is the longest Iron Age inscription found in this region. It parallels a story in 2 Kings 3, 4 through 28, where there's a war conflict between the northern kingdom of Israel and Moab, and the northern kingdom of Israel at this time allied with the southern kingdom. And the Moabite stone has these things in there that it describes. It identifies Chemosh as the god of Moab. It says that Omri, king of Israel, and his son, which would be Ahab, oppressed Moab. And it documents his rebellion against Israel. And it does it in kind of triumphant terms, as if he was completely successful. The Bible has the same account, and I guess you could say it spins it a little bit differently. One of the interesting things about all these different records from around about is that nobody ever mentions a military campaign in terms of a loss. But the Bible is very truthful when it describes Israel's campaigns. They lose a lot of battles. The Bible tells the story straight. All these other monuments kind of brag. This is another one that would be in that category. This is the Tel Dan stele. Somewhere around 870 to 750 BC, it was discovered in 1993 in Tel Dan, which is very far northern Israel on the border with Syria. It was set up by Hazael, who was king of Aram, reigning from 842 to 796 BC. And if the name rings a bell, it's because it's mentioned in the Bible. Hazael was anointed by Elijah, actually. And in 2 Kings 12 and 13, those chapters describe a conflict that he had with Jehoram, who is the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, who was the king of Judah at the time. They had briefly formed an alliance. And the Tel Dan stele has this text, and you can read it at your leisure, but I highlighted the red part there where he says, I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, who's son of Jehoram of the house of David. The Bible does mention those two kings fighting against Hazael, And the most significant thing about this particular text in the red is the phrase, the house of David, which is such a prominent phrase in the Bible. And here it's used even by a foreign king to describe the line of David in the nation of Judah. Item number 7 on our countdown is the Siloam Tunnel and the inscription that goes in it. This was a tunnel dug around 700 BC by King Hezekiah to divert water into Jerusalem in preparation for the Assyrian invasion. He said, why should the Assyrians come up here and find a lot of water? So he stopped up all the wells and he diverted the water using this tunnel into the city of Jerusalem. And the setup was such that the city got all the water and anybody outside the city got none of it. And it was really quite an engineering feat. This tunnel was 583 yards long with a drop of 12 inches. So the water flowed down 12 inches. Very, very gentle grade. Now, in order to do it, the diggers of the tunnel had to start from both sides and dig toward the middle. And that just had to be quite a bit of work. And when they were done, they were very proud of it. And they made this inscription recording what they had done. This particular inscription was discovered in 1838 by Jacob Spafford. And Jacob Spafford was the son of Horatio Spafford. Horatio Spafford wrote the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." Jacob Spafford was his adopted son, and he was the one who discovered this in Jerusalem inside the tunnel. And it says, the text there says the tunnel, and this is the story of the tunnel while, there are pieces where it's broken, so you can't be sure. The axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, maybe, the voice of a man called to his counterpart, for there was Zada in the rock. Now, Zada is the Hebrew word, but we don't know what Zada means. It's not a word which shows up in the Bible. So sometimes when you have an inscription like this in Hebrew, it's not necessarily sure that every word in there will be a word we know from the Bible. That's an example of one that isn't. So maybe there was a break in the rock or something on the right. And on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man toward his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits, and 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stonecutter. Number 6, bullas. Bullas are clay seals. And rather than just say one of them, I decided to group these together because they're just so many. The people that are listed on the left are all names which show up in the Bible, and there's clay seals from all of those folks. And it doesn't mean that the seal, they're used to seal a letter or something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that the seal that we've discovered belonged to the individual that's named in the Bible, because there could be more than one person with that name. But some of them probably are, and this is one which is probably genuine, because this doesn't just say Baruch, it says Baruch son of Neriah. And Baruch son of Neriah was the scribe who worked with the prophet Jeremiah. And this is kind of neat. This is a seal of Megiddo, which is a little bit more involved than most seals, because it has a beautiful drawing of a lion there. You can see the lion with its tail. And the seal says, belonging to Shema, servant of Jeroboam. Jeroboam is the name of one of the kings of Israel. Actually, there were 2 Jeroboams. So that's kind of neat. Number 5, this was just such a big deal, the city of David, that it's an entire archaeological park. As you could guess from the name, the city of David is in Jerusalem, in the southern part of the city. You can go into the park and see very, very extensive excavations of many things, the way the city was when David was king and afterwards, and a little bit of it is before, because some of it would be the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. And this particular structure is a very large stone step structure, which they believe is the remains of David's palace. So David had a royal palace, and there were several things to note about it. They did say that this appeared to be built in the Phoenician style, and that actually makes great sense because David was close buddies with Hiram, king of Tyre, Tyre being in Phoenicia there, and he helped build the temple too. And so having a palace in the Phoenician style would actually make sense. And also the location of the palace was uh, interesting because it was not found actually inside what would have been the Jebusite city walls. So the archaeologist who discovered it, I'm going to mess her name up, I think her last name was Mazar, actually used a text in the Bible to give her a clue that maybe David's palace was outside the walls. And so she decided to look in a different place from where people were trying to look, and this is what she found. So that was an interesting discovery. The number 4 is the Ketef Hinnom amulets. This was a silver amulet that was fairly small. Somebody apparently wore this amulet, and it has Hebrew writing on it. It was apparently an amulet used for warding off evil. And because of the wear and decay, only about half the letters are there. This dates to 600 BC, so good long time before Christ. And even though only half the letters are there, there's more than enough letters that really are there to let us know what it says. And what it says is, may the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So that is a scripture. It's in NumberSix, verses 24 through 26. And that makes this particular amulet the oldest remaining discovery of a Hebrew scripture, 600 BC. Number 3, my number 3 would probably surprise a lot of people because it's not quite as familiar a discovery as some of the other things, but to me, I thought it was kind of important. These are the Ugaritic texts, and this was discovered in Ras Shamra, Syria in 1928. These are quite old. They date to 1200 BC, and there's a lot of them, about 1,500 texts and fragments. The Ugaritic language for this text, although you can see, if you look closely enough, it's kind of written there in a cuneiform sort of form, but the language itself is close to Hebrew. And because of Ugaritic, we've learned a fair amount about biblical Hebrew from these Ugaritic texts. But maybe more significant is what we've learned a little bit about some of the Canaanite culture. The Bible mentions Baal quite a bit as the false god, that they had so much trouble with people worshiping Baal when they should not have been. But the Bible is not the least bit interested in giving us any kind of description of the theology of Baal and whatnot. So you could read it and you would not know from reading the Bible that Baal was the god of the thunderstorm. But we'd know that based on the Ugaritic texts. But now that we know that Baal is the god of the thunderstorm, suddenly some of the stories in the Bible make even more sense than they did before. Like the story of the contest between the Lord and Baal on Mount Carmel when Elijah was up there, and he challenged them, whichever God answered by fire was the real God. Well, so if Baal is the god of the thunderstorm, and you're going up on top of a mountain that's right next to the sea, what Elijah was doing is he was playing Baal's own game and Baal's home field, so to speak, because that's the sort of place where you would expect to see a thunderstorm, and a thunder or lightning would be a god answering by fire. So Baal was the god of the thunderstorm. Asherah was his consort. Asherah is frequently mentioned in the Old Testament too. Yam is the god of the sea, and Mot was the god of death. The fascinating thing about that is that the Hebrew word for sea is Yam, and the Hebrew word for death is Mot. And you could read the Bible all day long in Hebrew and never get the least clue that um, those words were actually not just words for sea and death, but they were the Canaanite names for the gods of sea and death. So I thought the Ugaritic texts were especially interesting and also enlightening to help us understand or learn a few more things about the Bible. Number two, this is sort of cheating, but I just couldn't go through a list without saying something about cities in general. So just a list of cities. There are so many cities which have been discovered, which have great archaeological indications. You know, you read the Bible and those cities are mentioned, and sometimes the archaeologists have gone through the land of Israel and they've kind of used the Bible to give them a hint as to where to dig. And so in these cases, I just listed some of the cities which show up in the Bible, and you have good archaeological sites. Sometimes a city which is not that prominent in the Bible has some of the biggest ones, like the picture here is from the city of Beth Shan. It's mentioned just a few times. It was on the city of Beth Shan that the Philistines hung the head of, I guess they hung the bodies of Saul and Jonathan after they defeated them and they died in a battle. But this is a very extensive archaeological site there at Beth Shan. Also places like Megiddo, Jericho, Beersheba, Hatzor, Capernaum, Bethel, Caesarea Philippi, Lachish, Ziklag. That's the ones I wrote. Those are just ones I could think of real fast, but there's a number more, and I just didn't think of them in the spur of the moment. But there's just so many cities, and you can visit pretty much all of them, and it's kind of interesting. And I had just one more because I think my favorite one, and one of the very largest ones, was Caesarea Maritima. Caesarea, next to the sea, this is where Paul was taken for his trial in the book of Acts. And Caesarea was the Roman headquarters when they were occupying the land of Judah. The theater there has been kind of restored, but this was a theater that they had built in the days of Herod the Great. The city was largely built by Herod the Great, and the ruins just go on and on from the right of the theater and on out. You can see the bathtub of the Roman governor, so probably Pontius Pilate took a bath there. The next to, if you look at this slide where I've written on the right, Caesarea Theater, immediately to the left there, you can see the beginning of what is a hippodrome. That would be a place where horses would race. There was also, it starts to build out into the ocean there, dock for ships. And if you go on further off to the right, there's an aqueduct, a large aqueduct to bring water down from the nearby mountains. So very extensive excavations there in Caesarea. And finally, my number one archaeological discovery is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this was such a large archaeological discovery of such significance that I'm going to cheat yet again. And rather than discuss it just in this video, I'm going to make a whole nother video on just the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's where I'm going to stop with this video on biblical archaeological discoveries. Thank you for watching, and I hope to come back with a video on the Dead Sea Scrolls soon.